Hello, hello. Welcome back to Detection at Scale. This is our first episode of season 3. I'm your host, Jack Naglieri, and we're going to do a little bit of a different focus this season. We're going to focus on the intersection of generative AI and security operations. And of course, we're going to hear from practitioners about what's working, what's not. And finally, if you haven't joined the conversation on Substack, head over there, just search for Detection at Scale, and you should find it. And that's long form content about a lot of the topics we have in the podcast. So with that out of the way, we'd love to introduce our guest today. Her name is Mor Levi. She's joining us from Salesforce, leading detection and response over there. Mor, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Jack. Happy to be here. Yeah, I can share a little bit about myself, how I came to be VP of Detection and Response at Salesforce. So I started my career in cybersecurity like roughly 15 years ago. My first intro was when I joined the Israeli military, like full disclosure, I'm originally Israeli. So that's kind of like where the funky name is. So that was my first intro, and I really fell in love in cybersecurity and security operations. And then fast forward for today, I've been working for various roles. I've been in cybersecurity startups doing detection at scale and detection engineering and detection research, and also doing individual contributor roles, so forensics, malware analysis, incident response, all that stuff. And today I'm responsible on the internal CSERT and threat detection teams at Salesforce, which is a huge company with a lot of products that needs a lot of protection. And it's a very, very interesting area to be in. So yeah, happy to share more about that.
Yeah, you've had an amazing experience in security for a long time. So I'm really excited to pick your brain and really interested in what you're working on right now. So, obviously Salesforce has been quite loud with Gen AI, with Agent Force. And, I live in San Francisco, so I get probably a little bit more exposure to a lot of the external marketing and branding in tech. But,
Yeah.
I'm really curious about like, has this sort of bled into the work that you're doing? Is that really like kind of embodied the whole company? And where have you had success so far with Gen AI and cybersecurity?
100%. So all of us are basically behind, in the middle, and the front of Agent Force. It's one of the most strategic products that we're launching as a company. And for us, it really has two or three different aspects. The first one is protecting it. It's one of the most innovative new products that a big tech like large language model type of a company released. It's an application layer on top of that. So it's a very new, interesting space to kind of like cope with and try to think what are the right ways to protect this and protect our customers. Also, the model is different because it's not like the LLM that it's like B2C, like consumers or everyone can just log in and use it. It's B2B, B2B2C sometimes. So it's a different type of operational model that we need to figure out. And on the other aspect is us using it. So we're drinking our own champagne and we're actually leveraging Agent Force as part of our automation and triage and autonomous investigations for security cases, as well as threat detection, descriptions, minor attack mapping, things like that. So we're really leveraging a lot of the good tools that Salesforce has across the board. And we're actually, again, drinking our own champagne and using those tools.
Okay, well, I have about 100 questions, so we'll
Yeah.
start with one. That's awesome. So, you know, Agent Force is probably going to be a similar type of pattern that we see just broadly over the next 10 years as more companies really figure out the best ways to incorporate LLMs. So, for detection teams listening who maybe don't have as much experience with LLMs and are maybe just starting to learn about it, like what can you tell people about monitoring LLMs and how, um, you know, keeping the inference and the agentic framework secure? Like, what have been your learnings there, and what's been effective?
So first of all, like every threat modeling, you need to understand the various use cases and the threat scenarios. So in our cases, there are various threat scenarios, but the most significant ones are basically around the abuse or the attempt to extract data through those LLMs. So first and foremost, I would say, what is the actual application of those agentic models for your company? What is the business logic? Who's going to use that? Is it going to be like a front for customers to have questions? Is it going to be for operators, for admins? It really depends on the scenario. And then based on the various use cases and the business implementations, that's when you start doing the threat modeling. So we looking at this from, as I said, multiple layers of basically abuse, fraud, data exfiltration options, and then malicious execution. So trying to manipulate the model to either do an action, exploit its capabilities, create hallucinations, which is also a thing, even though the risk when you have an agentic layer is not as big because the foundation, the infrastructure sits with the base model, like the LLM. So it's kind of like it's another layer on top of that.
Yeah, so a lot of it, from what I heard in that explanation, is really just around making sure there's good guardrails in the LLM, right? Like, because
Yes.
agents are naturally taking actions on behalf of users. So, how do we ensure that? And then I would imagine there's also a element of data access here too, right? Because LLMs have access to new types of databases and things like that. Like, has that been an emphasis as well?
Yeah, but again, all of those things are going through like the guardrails, the architecture, all of the in the implementation phase, and just basically put all of those controls up front. And then what we're trying to do is to identify any potential exploitation or misuse around those guardrails and controls that we already have. But again, this is a very uncharted territory. So we're learning as we're walking, or the company is running. We're trying to keep up as a security team, but it's really we're gonna learn as we go. Like because threat actors are also gonna find very creative ways that we're currently not thinking of right now. And again, as I said, abuse is one of those things where you can let customers leverage free trials and things. So you could have fraudsters or threat actors basically spin up free tenants and sending phishing from your tenant or things like that. So that's something that we've been across like a couple of times. And I guess we'll probably see more adaptations of those different flavors of abuse.
We see that type of abuse quite a lot on social media too, right? Like
Yeah.
researchers trying to jailbreak the model.
Yes. Yeah.
So for those, maybe you could just give a quick definition of what an agent is. I think we hear about agents a lot and we hear about LLMs a lot, but maybe you could just kind of level set everyone like what an agent is.
The most simplistic way I can kind of like explain that is basically an application layer on top of an LLM infrastructure. So if we have LLM like ChatGPT, like O1 or O4, whatever, I don't know which model they're in there right now, or Gemini. So basically, that's the large language model, which is very generic. So you can ask it any type of question and you'll get a fairly good answer. But the agentic layer is basically an application layer on top of that large language model that is basically operating on a specific data set that it has access to. So it leverages all the goodness, like the richness that the large language model has, but it's very focused on the data set. So you can think about it as like context aware language model, and it's not as generic, not as large. It's kind of like a subset of what you get from the large language model with the relevancy of the data that you have. I hope that simplified things.
Yeah, I really like that framing actually, the application layer on top of the LLM. I think that's a really great way to think about it because the applications have specific goals that they're trying to
Yeah.
accomplish, and
Yeah.
LLMs in their nature are very generic. So it's like specialization. So when we talk about the specialization of agents and DNR, you listed a lot of different things. You said automation and triage and autonomous investigation, threat detection, MITRE mappings, things like that. Can you sort of step through this agentic workflow for security use case, like let's call it like automated triage?
So, as we all know, there is a full evolution of like trying to automate how we triage and how we detect things. I would say, go down the history lane for a second. We started with like very simple detection logics in a SIM. Many times it would either be a threshold or multiple fails and a success and things like that. And then an analyst would pick it up and they have like an SOP or a process and they just walk through, if this and that, if this and that. type of a guideline of how to triage. Fast forward, we moved to SOAR platforms. We're able to implement some of those guidelines, as part of playbooks and automation. And I really fast forward for today, what we're doing is actually to take those guidelines and to basically train those agents, those models about if this is the type of a case, let's say this is a phishing case. Usually we would say an analyst, okay, go check the sender, see in the email headers, are there any attachments? If there is an attachment, send it to a sandbox, check any URLs, extract any URLs, any IPs, anything, any IOCs that you can, throw it into a sandbox or in like a AI feed, get the results, see what you get. So we would leverage a store probably to extract all of that stuff and send it and then get the data back. And then an analyst would look at that. With an agent, you can actually combine between the SOAR and the agent to do all of those things, and the agent can get a conclusion eventually based on the SOP or a process that an analyst would look at, and based on previous historical cases that it's looked at that are similar under that cluster category, and make a determination. So we're actually in this point right now where we are kind of like fine tuning the agents based on different scenarios and different types of cases. And we're kind of like fine tuning, all of our documentation and guidelines for analysts, and it's as good as your data. It's important to say. So the data is not always perfect. So that's why we're still having our analysts go through the recommendations of those agents. But the idea is that by the end of this year, we could have like 50% of autonomous triage from the cases, like the intake that we have as of today.
50% would be a massive improvement of efficiency,
Yeah.
obviously.
Yeah. And the idea behind it, it's important to say, it's not to kind of like cut off on the workforce or whatever. It's more about let the analysts focus on things that we cannot completely automate and the more complex things that require a human to actually think rather than repetitive, more simple, let's just say, cases. So it's really the idea is to kind of have more from our people and to leverage them to do the more complex things and basically leverage the agent, as our CEO Mark Benioff said, as the digital labor. You know, so that's where we're going. It's like another industrial revolution right here, right now.
It absolutely is. So when you say 50% is autonomous, is that start to finish, or is it, maybe the first 90% or whatever, and then the analyst is like, okay, that looks good?
The goal is start to finish. So closing a case, like from the moment we got a case into our case system, all the way for the triage, prioritization, categorization, analysis, etc. The goal is to get to end-to-end 50%, and this by the end of this year. Again, those are internal goals that we put for ourselves as like the detection and response organization. But right now, it's the initial phase of like categorization and kind of like suggesting what is the next step. Today, it's like 90%.
Wow, that's impressive. That's great progress as well. And, the beauty with a lot of this as well is as new foundation models are released that are better reasoning, that should help the, analysis agent be able to draw better conclusions or to take the learnings from the past and reincorporate them in more effective ways. I've been really fascinated on the concept of agent memory. And you mentioned that you're effectively taking the conclusions from the closed, the autonomous sort of triage and feeding it back in. And have you seen that also improves either efficacy or time to close or inference cost? Like, have you seen that make a dent yet in progress?
Yes and no, because as I said, it's really based on the data that you have. And if the data that you have is not great, so we are spending at least a quarter right now to fine tune the model and its suggestions. And it's not just all depends on the model, to be honest, because let's say, one of our detection pipelines, it's like very catch-all type of a case types, right? So it could be someone sending an email, reporting on something. It could be an alert. So it's a huge bucket that has like 50 different categories of things, and most of them are like natural language. And the thing is, if you leverage only LLM, if you run the same prompt on the same case or the same question, you won't necessarily get the same answer, right? You need to do prompt engineering around it to make sure you get that consistency. And even when you get an answer, it's not necessarily the most accurate answer. For example, categorize which type of a case this is for me. So we spend like in the past 3 months a good amount of time just to kind of like fine tune this area and to improve the model. But we also understand that we need to have a better, let's say, segregation of duties and basically create different detection pipelines for different cases. And that will really help us to get like this huge growth and improvement of the way the model is operating. So we need to help the model a little bit. We shouldn't, at least from our experience, you shouldn't expect you to just throw everything on it and it will just do the magic.
So when you say it's only as good as your data, are you referring to the data that's available and the sort of maybe initial analysis that you're doing in your detection layer? Is that what you mean by that?
Yeah. Yeah. And determination that analysts did for cases. So just say I get like, I don't know, 5,000 phishing cases, I don't know, a month. Okay. Let's throw those numbers. So it's really going to base it, like its quality will be based on how we closed those cases previously and what determination we made. So if someone made a determination about something and this is the wrong one, for example, they said this is not a phishing, it's a benign email, and it's actually a malicious email. So, the model will learn that mistake, right? So that's why we have like this second layer of like testing or looking into the results of what the model is doing.
Makes a lot of sense. That loop is super important just generally for all types of AI applications. So great to see
And
it here.
automation also one step before even. Yeah.
Do you see SOAR and agents as like mutually exclusive, or like how should we think about that?
It really depends on how robust your agent capabilities to action on things. And in many cases, the action piece requires engineering, it requires permissions, it requires a lot of things. So if your agent really is just scoped around like making a determination or a decision based on its available data, but it can't action on that, that's where you need to have a combination with a source. So you can basically tell the agent, okay, let's say this is a malicious email. If I go back to the phishing example, this is a malicious email. So kick off this playbook that's going to delete that email from the inbox for that user. And we notify that user that we've identified blah, blah, blah. And maybe we add like the sender or any other IOCs we got into our PI, database. So you basically tie the agent into the existing automations you have, and the agent would trigger them. And again, this is really depends because if you've implemented action capabilities for the agent, you can probably do some of those things, but it also depends what the scope of access the agent has. If it's only limited to a specific application, for example, for us, limited only to the area where we're managing our cases. So anything beyond that would require the agent to learn. And that's the thing. It's kind of like the scope a little bit for the agent to do that, because it's an application on top of a specific scenario use case. Now, the larger use case for Salesforce, it's like a whole group and portfolio of products that are talking with each other. So when Salesforce is saying agent force, you can actually action across large array of products because you have like marketing cloud and sales cloud and MuleSoft and a lot of other and Slack, blah, blah, blah. So they're all communicating with each other. But for our specific use case in security, it's a bit more limited. Does that make sense? I hope it's not like confusing.
You were just talking about agent to agent, right?
Yeah.
That's the future that I'm excited to live in.
It's
But
gonna take some time. It's not like
yeah,
today, but yeah, it's gonna happen though. Like I'm thinking maybe it's gonna take some time, but actually maybe it's gonna just take a year. I don't know. Like things are happening so quickly. It's like exponentially moving so crazy. Yeah.
one of the things that you inspired just hearing you explain it is around the idea of the because LLMs inherently are non-deterministic, there's good and bad there, right? The good is that it can adapt a investigation on the fly, right? Like that's great. The bad obviously is that when you need it to do deterministic things, you don't always have that guarantee. So it's a really interesting intersection where you probably want determinism in detection and maybe less about atomic alerts and more just about labeling. Like this
Yeah,
is a authentication event, or this is an event where someone downloaded data that might be sensitive, but we don't want
yeah,
to send an alert. So anyway, there's like that side of it. And then the other side is repetitive action. And AI can actually help create those, right? Because AI
yeah,
is really good at writing things,
yeah.
natural language, source code, whatever. So, you mentioned detection and threat modeling. Is that something that you've had success with as well with LLMs?
Right now, our implementation of LLM or Agent Force for detection is mainly around the description and tagging of the MITRE attack techniques like TTPs and the description of the logic. So instead of my threat detection engineers, in addition to building the logic and doing the research and accuracy and everything else, we'll also need to write the documentation. And if this happens, this is what you do and all that stuff. That's where they're implementing LLM, but there's definitely a broader range of use cases that we can leverage. Like future wise, I would say LLM could potentially look on the set of rules and logics that we have and look into logs. And then you can talk with it like an assistant and tell him, okay, I want to create a new detection logic for session hijacking for blah. Those like find all the detections that are like session hijacking logic and help me, build a new logic based on the logs located in this table. Go have a look, those are the fields, blah, blah. So the way I see agent is like assistants for analysts and engineers. And in some cases, they're just going to take over some of the repetitive work that can be done completely autonomously. So that's where I'm seeing this going to basically double our workforce in a sense that it's going to double our capacity, from the people that we have because the company is going to keep growing, but you can't grow people endlessly. And again, that's why Agent Force is such a big deal.
What was the phrase digital workforce?
Yeah, that was Mark Benioff's.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean,
Yeah.
doubling the capacity is very powerful, obviously. And it most likely ends up becoming exponential once you hit a certain stride, right?
Yeah. But that's going to be the learning curve. That's going to be, there's a lot of ifs in there, but I think we're well positioned to overcome those ifs more than ever, more than before. And I had my share of working with SOAR platforms for the past 7 years. So pretty early on, which were great. Like they really helped us to, push the needle, move the needle, but not end to end. You still needed to have humans involved in there, and the level of adoption wasn't that easy. You still needed to know how to write like Python code. You still need to know like a lot of like coding principles. And with LLM, creating like prompt engineering, it's a new skill, but I just I just think the learning curve for that is not as intense as you need to know Python, you need to understand security, you need to know how to operate the SOAR playbooks. You need to run unit tests. All those things.
The learning curve is just your natural language, right? Like that's the
Yeah,
beauty of it.
yeah. It's natural language, and you just need to have a good sense of like what do you expect the agent to do, right? So, like writing a project plan or something like that. So, if you're able to do that and plan ahead, you should be fairly good.
It's exciting times.
Definitely exciting.
So, what do you think the analyst evolves into? So, if this is doing most of their triage work, you mentioned they can get freed up. Like, what is that work?
So that work is the more complex things that requires thinking. So a lot of like building hypothesis for threat hunting, building hypothesis for threat detection. So as I mentioned, you can potentially automate or use the agent to assist you for building detections, but you need to give an input, some sort of an input. So you need to think on the things that you want to detect. What are the scenarios? What are the risks? What are the gaps that I have? So I read about it a lot, in general about LM and AI. And at the end of the day, there is a saying that there's going to be a need for developers because AI could develop the code, but there will be a need for like artists. And in a sense that someone will need to have the vision, will need to have the ideas, will need to think about what they want this to do. Because this is a tool, and a tool is as good as, the user that is using it, right? So that's why I think, if in the past I needed, I don't know, like 6 analysts a shift to cover X amount of cases, maybe with the 50%, autonomous triage, I could use 3 analysts or just for the triage stuff. And then the other 3 I can use for threat hunting, for forensics, for dealing with incidents, do the communication piece, the human element. If we are in security, there's still a huge human element of like communication, coordination, all of those things.
There will always be a need for artists is a really great
Yeah.
way to think about it.
Yeah.
And, in a lot of ways, LLMs, the quality of their output is dictated by their input. So that's to say, if you give bad input, you're probably going to get bad output,
Yeah.
and it's heavily biased for better or for worse. So that's a great point, and that's probably a good reason why we don't want to 100% rely on it yet, right? Because you
Yeah.
still need to
Yeah.
direct it. But it does change probably everyone's role going forward, right? Like
Yeah.
less about doing the writing and more about, well, what's the point that I want to make, you know?
Yeah. That's why I said it's like an industrial revolution for the 21st century for real this time. And you can also leverage that to do some testing of quality. Again, you just need to plan ahead. You just need to think, what is the standard? And that's the artist type of mindset. I have a vision. Now, how do I achieve that vision? What's the standard that I want to have? What is the end goal? All of those things. If you're capable in doing that, that's an amazing tool to help you get there.
So what was the logic for deciding where to start with agents? So you went into triage. Did you have other options? Were you thinking of other alternatives, or how did you think about it?
That was the most painful area and the most, I think, low hanging fruit we found to leverage LLM. And also, we have enough people to kind of like double check the output because we are already today spending X amount of resources and manually triaging that. So if those analysts need to manually triage what the LLM or the agent did, and that will, in the short term will reduce X% of their capacity of their load. And then in the longer term, it will reduce, I don't know, 2X of their load. And then they can develop their career to focus on, more complex things and develop their cybersecurity thinking, their communication skills, their incident management skills, maybe go to the shift left area and become security engineers, look into architecture, secure development, things like that. I think that would be great. But yeah, the initial reasoning of going there, it's like it's the biggest pain point. We have a huge volume of cases, and we thought it should be easy enough, air quotes, as a first use case to tackle.
So this is effectively our version of a coding assistant, for security.
Yeah, 100%. Yes, yes. And I'm very grateful that I have the opportunity to really kind of like test out this crazy technology at Salesforce. It's like a huge privilege. I worked for startups previously. And of course, when you're in a startup, you're like in the forefront of technology and you're like doing innovative things and things like that. But you don't really have that type of like backing infrastructure in tech company. Of course, it's a tech company. So all that stuff, it's a huge privilege to try out some of the most cutting edge capabilities and apply it for security.
Especially when there's both like the company support and a framework.
Exactly.
Lowers the barrier quite a bit.
Yeah, 100%. Yes.
Awesome. Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I've learned so much from listening to you explain your thought
Thank you.
process around Gen AI, and makes me even more fired up to go to work every day. So to kind of wrap this up, there's 2 questions I have. One is, what big advancements do you foresee like continuing to influence cybersecurity? And then what's one piece of actionable advice you would give to folks implementing Gen AI in cybersecurity?
So I'll answer the first question first. I think, the big advancements, it's like we're it's the cliche, but the tip of the iceberg right now with AI implementation, agents, it's kind of like a recent concept. LLM, it's been a while, like for the past 2 years, been widely used, but companies are now starting to understand the implementation of that. Salesforce were pretty much a first mover on the agent piece. And I believe there's going to be a lot more companies in that area. So that means there's going to be another layer of complexity from a security perspective, guardrails, how do we shift left and which controls do we have? And even when everything fails, how do we protect that? I definitely see that as like a huge, huge, huge vector. That's, because it's a huge business vector, it's going to be a huge threat vector. Unfortunately, that's the way it works. And piece of advice for people that are trying to implement LLM, I would say be very focused on the use cases that you want to use it, because it's so rich and so broad that if you're not focused on what is the outcome that you want to get out of it, and you have a very clear use case with a success criteria, let's call it, like every product, um, then it would be too generic, unpredictable, and it will probably fail. So I would just take one project, create the guardrails around that project and use cases for the LLM, and try to put as many prompt engineering and protections so you'll have a consistent output from the LLM.
Awesome. Mor, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thanks for kicking off the season. Really appreciate your time. It's been great having you on. Is there anything you'd like to get out to the audience?
We're always hiring, always, just look on our hiring pages and recruitment pages. We're currently hiring in APAC, but in general, we're always hiring. So I'll publish on my LinkedIn if anything comes up in AMER or EMEA or any other region. But yeah, and other than that, it's been great. I really enjoyed our conversation, and yeah, happy to kick off the first episode for the year.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And we'll be back soon. Thank you all.